Hello, once again, it's time for Mitchell Talks Energy with Jerry Bohnen. I'm Mitchell Talks. That's Jerry Bohnen. Good to see you this morning.
Hey, how are you?
Good. So I've just finished my week of lessons on OK Energy Today, which I signed up for, by the way, which is easy to do, as we say when we close shows every week. And so I'm trying to figure out the sequencing of how these stories all fit together. There's a lot, but maybe we should begin with Civics 101. I know there's some really, really good reporters in Oklahoma, some of a very few covering the Capitol compared to the old days. But when I hear a journalist say the bill is dead for the session, I want to contact their professor and tell them to recall their degree.
Mm-hmm.
Dead is not dead.
No.
It ain't no such thing. And so the reason I'm going on that rant is because I've said this ever since I started watching the Oklahoma legislature in the late 70s as a kid reporter. There is, back then we were in session in January, but today, February, March, and April are somewhat orderly, okay, because you have about every 3 weeks you introduce the bill, you have to have committee work on them, they have to pass the committee, there's a deadline for that. And then there's a deadline for floor action. And then there's a deadline for getting them off floor and over to the other house, where the other chamber, rather, has to do committee work within a certain amount of weeks. And there's a deadline there. And then it has to go to the floor, excuse me, which is where we're at now. So Senate bills have to be acted on the floor of the House and vice versa. And then if you look at the calendar on this, there's some time left after the deadlines. What happens? Well, October comes early, right? The witching hour. I mean, all bets are off in the month of May. True. A couple of weeks ago, Jerry, we had all this theater about, we're far behind on the budget, far behind. Today, we've got news saying, well, we're ahead. So, you always take a grain of salt on this. And the second thing is, the point I'm getting to is that a lot of the legislation, as you pointed out in our show prep that we've been watching, is just sitting there. And some of it has not followed the regular path. And then you get into the magical budget items. And right now, the bill, as I kind of bring this up to the present, House Bill 4097, the no-for-rofer bill, did not get a hearing in the Senate. So it's not going to be heard on the floor, most likely. But then comes JCAP, Joint Committee on Appropriations. Both sides are talking transparency. The moral to this long-winded story is House Bill 4097, the no-for-rofer bill, ain't dead. And if you think that the proponents of this bill are not trying to revive this thing like Frankenstein with a interstate battery and, jumper cables on the neck.
Oh, yeah.
You would be wrong. That's what's going on behind the scenes right now.
Well, that bill, add in there the other ones that we've been mostly interested in, was the so-called Oklahoma Corporation Commission Efficiency Act, where that would make them exempt from 11 different variations or such of the Public Meetings Act. And then there's the one regarding proposed mileage for corporation commissioners. They're just sitting there. And we don't know what's really going to transpire at all. And so it's up, like you say, it ain't dead. Ain't a word, I know that. But but nonetheless, we're keeping an eye on those. And it's just waiting to see what might happen. And we'll find out.
You can suspend them. Both chambers can suspend the rules. I mean, that's the thing that I think that reporters miss oftentimes is that leadership gets together. You can suspend the rules. You can have state questions advanced in the month of May. If both sides agree, spend the rules, pop it out on the floor. It's happened a billion times in our state's history. And so we'll see. It's interesting, though. There's somebody else that, well, obviously, I can look at OK Energy today and see where Americans for Prosperity, they're still working hard against 4097. And speaking of groups working hard against it, out in the open, AARP, you have a story this morning that I was surprised about. Really not surprised, but interested in, which is the AARP. They're going to take to the web for a virtual town hall to update people on, guess what?
Yeah.
The bills that the media says are dead. And Sean Voskuil, who's the president of AARP Oklahoma, if this stuff was dead and tucked away for the rest of the session, they would not be doing this.
No, that's Thursday morning, I think at 11 o'clock, and he'll update them on a number of issues, including rate hikes, OG&E's rate hike, which would, if approved, as requested, adding, $19 on average a month to a residential bill. And I suspect that will be widely attended by AARP members, and we'll see where that's going. It's working its way through the Corporation Commission right now, so it's another. At the same time, I posted a story Monday morning regarding the Energy Information Administration, the federal government, basically saying that in 2023, electricity bills across the country averaged a 2% increase, but inflation was also 4.1%. So while I guess the utilities might use something like that as support for their rate hike, saying, well, we aren't as bad as inflation. Nonetheless, whenever I read the complaints or objections or opposition of ratepayers who make their filings regarding some of these rate hikes, they all complain, and rightfully so, that senior citizens, it's very difficult to keep up with inflation when their electricity bills continue to go up.
Yeah, I suppose they could spin it that way, but
I know
it
would be a very precarious, decision.
Okay, so I'm getting murdered by inflation, and I'm getting murdered by increasing electric rates, but I should feel pretty good about one more straw on the camel's back. It's just,
that's right. So
you can try. I mean, they could roll that one out if they try.
And it's what's the question, I guess, is, well, what about when we had maybe 1% inflation? What were electricity rates doing then?
It will be interesting, but this is, as you said, is going to be on a Facebook page, and don't sleep on that, because I recall this is 24, so 4 years ago during COVID, people were using Facebook Lives, including me.
Mm-hmm.
And during the COVID, when we were doing those once a week at the height of that, we had millions and millions of views. And so a lot of people, a lot of people that this is how they get their news. That's just the way it is. That's how I get I don't sit down at the computer in the morning to get OK Energy today. This is how I read it. I've plugged it twice. So just go ahead. Let's go ahead and get that aspect of it. So people, in case you're curious at all, how that you get on your newsletter, Jerry?
Well, go to okenergytoday.com and find the little column over there about subscriptions. It's free. We don't, transfer your email address to anyone else. We keep it under lock and key, well, so to speak, and it's protected. And so, become among the thousands who read our daily newsletter. It's worthwhile. I like to do stories that are out of the ordinary as well, that apply to energy, whether it's transportation, anything like that. And stories that you normally don't read elsewhere, or that you certainly don't hear maybe in your local TV newscast.
Speaking of those, we saw and this was an Oklahoma, we'll head this one, the props on this one to the Oklahoman, where because we were speaking about getting it on the internet. Mike Sanders and his group had an op-ed in the Oklahoma this weekend and talking
Yes.
about how this is
Mhm.
and this wiring this up, which has been a big deal for Speaker McCall and the governor, that he's comparing it to, electrification of 90 years ago. Now the electricity cost a lot more, as we just covered the 90 years ago, but
That's true. Yeah,
it's
and I'm
Sanders
one of
and his
those.
people. I was just going to say Sanders and his people, they never stop over there. They're moving forward. It's such an important role, Jerry.
It is, and it is like bringing rural electricity across America, and yeah, they're moving at a fast pace, and I think what they're I can't recall the number that they're at out of the 77 counties. There's something like 50, something like that. That they're expanding too quickly and expect to do so in 2025. So there won't be very many counties that will not have access to high-speed internet availability. When he compares it to bringing electricity or REA, I remember that as a young boy back when I was growing up on a farm in western Kansas. When the REA came. Otherwise, I hate to date myself, but we had what we call a wind charger on our farm, and it was quite a bit higher than your typical windmills that we think of that pumped water. And I still can hear that clanking. It was a two-bladed prop that was high on the top, and I think it produced 32-volt electricity for the farm. And then you stored it in these huge glass, very thick glass batteries in the basement of the house. And we still have those batteries. They're quite interesting and such. And then REA came and replaced it.
Okay, I'm reminded of Harry Truman, my favorite Truman quote: "The only thing we don't know is the history we haven't read yet." Now, I've got to ask you
I
some
like that.
questions here. All right. I've never heard of this. So give us circa time so as to not spend too much time on dating ourselves.
Uh-huh.
When would your family have purchased this item?
You know,
And when was
I,
it working?
I don't know. It was always there, but I remember when REA finally arrived. This would have been in the really early 50s. And but we've always had that wind charger, and it had to have come sometime during the 20s and 30s.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah,
I've never heard of this, but now I'm completely curious about. You
no,
know,
and the tower is still there.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, it's like a giant windmill that for a windmill to pump water for cattle and horses and such.
Hell, I know you're gonna think later today. When did my folks get those? Where did they purchase them? What was the name of them? Now I'm completely curious about that sort of stuff because, obviously, if you're on the prairie in western Kansas, and you're on the farm, you got a lot of things to take care of. That is fascinating to me.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
and I like to think of, for instance, your Rural Electrification Association. In those years, it didn't take much for one to lose power. The lines would go down, but the improvements are so dramatic and drastic over the course of those many years that sure, we lose power in the rural areas of the state, but it doesn't seem to last as long. Not you certainly don't go 1 or 2 weeks, at a time.
man, that's an interesting story. Let
Yeah,
me ask you one final question about that as we
yeah.
get out of the Bohnen family history. How, just say, take a car battery for our point of reference. How big were the batteries compared to, say, an automobile battery?
Oh well, I mean, I can't remember how many. There might have been a dozen or something. They were about Oh, well, they were like 1 foot by 1 foot, and wires stemming through each or into the top of each one. They were an open top battery, and the glass was maybe almost an inch thick to hold them. I'll have to get some pictures, and we'll do a historical review someday here on the podcast. How's
Oh,
that?
I'd love to do that. That is
Yeah.
just fascinating. We're in the process of trying to figure out my wife's her grandfather was a Western Kansas boy, went to OU, and nobody in the family's alive can tell us why he was at OU. And I said, probably
Yeah.
because anything but go to KU if you're a Western Kansas boy. I mean, that would be verboten, right?
KU or K-State?
Well, if you're, I think that's K-State territory where he was from, Tipton. So
Where?
Tipton.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I believe it's Timken. I'm sorry, Timken.
No, wait, Timken? Okay.
Yes.
I know where that is too.
So I think people out there are purple. I don't think they're blue.
That's
Okay.
true.
So
Yeah,
it might
that's
just
right.
be the family like, you ain't going to KU.
That's right.
Or if you go to Norman, just go to KU.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Okay.
it doesn't take long to lose out why families do certain things in a couple of
Yeah.
generations. But now
No.
this, upcoming, this will be a trip down Bohnen genealogy electricity lane. While we're speaking about that, another thing that has popped up. There's a lot of discussion right now about the Attorney General and a lot of activity over there. But let's start with this story that you did this week about keeping the records confidential in the upcoming hearings dealing with this alleged price gouging on the winter 2021 storm. It's very complicated. I'm looking for the hook on here. I'm not sure who's wanting to keep records confidential. I suppose the companies. It's very complicated. You explain it, but this ties back to those charges against those companies that allegedly overbilled.
Right. And we're talking about the lawsuits, the market manipulation lawsuits that the Attorney General filed in Osage County District Court against Symmetry Solutions, and the other one, which is basically a subsidiary of Energy Transfer. So 5 days after he filed those lawsuits on behalf of the Grand River Dam Authority, the Attorney General then asked a judge regarding whether, so in the course of investigating and in leading to the lawsuits, they used confidential information from the two companies in question. This is very similar to when or utilities go before the Corporation Commission or any utility regulator in any state. They usually like to have a confidential approval of certain records. It's for competition purposes. And so they had, there were some of these confidential files that were used to determine the basis for the lawsuit. And so the Attorney General is asking the judge, okay, make a ruling now. Do these confidential records have to remain confidential in this lawsuit? He wants those confidential records. He thinks the public has a right to see the records upon which the Attorney General based his allegations against the two firms. It was kind of it was complicated, but that's basically what he's after, Scott. He wants the public to see the confidential information that led or that caused them to ascertain, hey, this is wrongdoing on the part of these two firms. It was, and the judge, as of Friday, had not ruled on that request.
Well, that will be something to watch.
It would be. It would be a ruling in favor of the Attorney General, Gentner Drummond.
And he's been busy on a number of fronts.
Oh, wow.
Including the methane rules, a lot of things like that.
Yeah. I think I've reported in the past couple of weeks how he's filed, I don't know, 3 to 5, something like that, where he's joined attorneys general from other largely Republican states in challenging what the EPA, basically contending that the EPA overstepped its authority. One of the most recent was, let's see, he's opposing the EPA's use of race in determining pollution. And some of these cases have been led by attorneys general in Kentucky and in Florida. He's challenged the overstepping of bounds regarding methane enforcement or regulations against the oil and gas industry. It's really surprising, but at the same time, you have to sit back and wonder, so do these Republican attorneys general basically have an organization, a loose-knit organization where they get together? Okay, what are we going to challenge now? If you thought Scott Pruitt, the former attorney general, and who went on to become the EPA administrator for a short time, you thought he was a challenge. Kentner Drummond's making quite a name for himself in challenging the EPA as well.
That is true. A lot of activity out of the AG's office. One of the interesting stories that recently went up was this Oklahoma Rural Association study on ESG. Now, let's start with what ESG is, Jerry. What happened in Oklahoma, and these folks of the Oklahoma Rural Association, these are not leftist activists. In fact, these are Farm Bureau people, former Farm Bureau people. I would call them, one's an former Inhofe staffer, and these are very conservative people. And they're saying ESG, this legislation on ESG, is hurting rural Oklahoma. Can you break it all down for us?
Right. We had that story Monday morning. And so this group, the Oklahoma Rural Association, they carried out a study. Now, what they're targeting is Oklahoma's 2-year-old law that targeted financial institutions, BlackRock, a whole number of others that used ESG, environment, social governance, in withholding funds or finances for the oil and gas industry. And that was quite a development when Oklahoma, I think, followed Texas in doing something like that. So it banned at least 10 to 12 different financial organizations that favored more green energy developments with their financial loans than they did oil and gas. Well, now here it comes with the Oklahoma Rural Association with its study, which was conducted by Dr. Travis Roach. He's an associate professor at the University of Central Oklahoma, chairman of the Department of Economics, and he's also founder of the Central Policy Institute. And he contends in his study that by banning state agencies from investing or being managed by, let's say, BlackRock and a number of others. I hate to pick out BlackRock, but that seems to be one that was really highly targeted initially. But he says it's led to $185 million in unnecessary costs for Oklahoma municipalities, and it increased borrowing costs by nearly 16%. Actually, it's 15.7%. And so we're talking about increased borrowing costs, higher taxes, and it's reducing expenditures in other areas. If you recall, state treasurer was sued because the treasurer is the administrator of this particular law. It's called the Energy Discrimination Elimination Act. And he was sued last November by a former executive of the Oklahoma Public Employees Association. That lawsuit is still in Oklahoma County District Court, where he contends that it's hurting retirees who have their money invested, like through Oklahoma Public Employees Association. And it just simply comes down to a study now showing that, hey, this law is really hurting the state. And the legislature, quickly pounced on this and adopted that law in 2022.
And some of the people that some of the entities are well known that can't do business with the state, including BlackRock, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, Bank of America, State Street, and a whole list of big companies out there. It's interesting, though, that whenever you trying to figure out what the GOP is today, so instead of more competition, Reagan used to say that it was government that was the enemy of the markets. And here we have, in this particular case, government came in and restricted markets. And the Oklahoma Rural Association, the president of that, Monica Collison, she's pretty clear about this. Your quote that you have in your story, the negative impact of this act on Oklahoma taxpayers and communities was completely avoidable. And that it hits, this is not a quote, but I'm including this in the quote. These are areas of underserved and rural areas that shows, the research shows a direct negative result of these failed policies. That's a pretty stout language about what's going on there.
What I think equally interesting is the fact that some months ago, I carried a series of reports showing that, for instance, BlackRock had actually considerable holdings in oil companies in Oklahoma whenever they filed their annual reports with the SEC. And, it kept piling up. I mean, the more, this company filed a report, and here's BlackRock holding 5, 6, maybe 7, 8% of the shares of that company. And so it naturally raised the question, if they're investing or continuing to invest in oil and gas companies in the state, then why do they remain on the list? Well, the list is only reviewed it's annually. And so the next one won't be up until maybe August, I believe.
The difficulty is trying to do an absolute on something that is very liquid and changeable at these markets. What you have the biggest energy company in the world, ExxonMobil, biggest market cap out there investing in renewables. You have renewable companies out here drilling natural gas wells. And I'd bet you a big stake on this one that you'd get a lot of legislators, if you ask them, do wind companies drill for natural gas? They probably say no. The industry is becoming integrated in terms of the lines of business that they have. Oil and gas, fossil fuels, and renewables. It's happening, and it's just not something that we see a lot in the media.
But at the same time, the whole scenario has changed regarding the dynamics, the politics of it. 2-3 years ago, some of these corporate leaders of financial firms bent over backwards to, I guess, go along with the big green energy push of the Biden administration, and they wanted to seem friendly to green energy. Well, times have changed, and the politics of it has gone along with that as well. They've backed off this over eagerness to seem, green friendly. And so they've changed some of their ESG policies. And it's not just BlackRock or Wells Fargo. You're seeing it in a lot of major corporations that, yes, they still want to get the support of the green energy and the environmentalists and such. But at the same time, they realize that they've gotten some bad press over their overeager ESG policies.
It's not an easy nut to crack.
No, it's not.
But it is good to have discussion and studies like the Rural Association to make people go, we should check into that.
Well, the next step will be, Scott, what will the legislature do?
Yeah, and by the way, the interesting aspect, further fascinating, is that in 25 you're going to have complete new leadership in the state legislature. I mean, there are some people that have been running the show for a long time are terming out. I'm speaking of both the pro tem and the speaker.
Yes.
And their teams are, going to be terming out. Got a new, the way it stands right now, you'd have a new pro tem in Senator Graydon McCourtney. And so the speaker pro tem is Kyle Hilbert from up in northern Oklahoma, I believe Depew. And so, there'll be different changes, and it's like, I'll tell people, I'm going to see the Reds this weekend down to play the Rangers. It's the youngest team in baseball. I'm a Packers fan, youngest team in football. And the Oklahoma legislature, it's going to get younger, a lot younger, okay, depending on how the elections go. But you're right. Last thing I wanted to bring up this morning is we were kind of wringing our hands, worrying what was going to happen over there with this Middle East. You did a story this week that when Israelis opened fire on Iran, well documented, and I think probably it was just because there's so many superpowers involved in this. It was like, hey, we're going to be launching on you just like the Iranians did.
Yeah.
Here comes our missiles. This was not Pearl Harbor. That how it was going to affect the markets, and the prices actually went down when the Israelis hit Iran. How in the world does that happen?
Well, actually, it was when Iran fired, 300 drones and missiles and everything, and it just kind of, I think one got through. And, I think you and I had talked about this briefly a week ago, and I thought, it was such a utter failure on the part of Iran that I don't think, I think the world markets will sit back and go, it's not going to interrupt the flow of oil very much at all. And it didn't. And prices didn't soar like some people thought. And that's what I told you, if you recall. And so the same thing with when Israel responded with its own barrage against Iran. But it still sent a message, but the prices didn't fluctuate very much at all. And if anything, they dropped below $90 a barrel briefly for Brent crude, which is the global benchmark. And here in the States, West Texas Intermediate crude, the U.S. benchmark, it's hovering, around $83, $84, maybe even less a barrel this week.
And gas prices, they're like holding steady high.
Yeah.
And the stuff like that's going to impact the presidential election, and mostly against the current president, President Biden, to have people still reminded you're paying. Man, my truck burns that crappy stuff, the 87.
Oh,
it's got all the ethanol in it. But a lot of people can't burn that. And so I'm paying right at 3. So I don't know what that 91's going for, but holy moly. I mean, that's going to be, the issues for the presidential election.
It is.
Abortion, the southern border, inflation. And those are the 3 that the candidates are going to have to navigate when one of them is not in court. Is, I'm tired of hearing the word unprecedented, but man, we got to come up with another word, because we're watching a presidential election in real time that's never happened before. The last one was weird. This one's going to be more weird. So
weird.
Buckle up.
Hey, sounds good.
Jerry, thanks for a really, really informative week, and always appreciate everything we get on OK Energy today, which is we spoke of earlier. You just go on there and sign up, get that daily. Mine comes out just a little after 4, I think, Jerry.
I have it scheduled to go out at 4. I work all night long on this.
I know. You never sleep. So.
I don't.
All right. Thanks again, and we will see you next week.
Buckle up. We'll see you then.